And some of the cool things that we've uncovered. Last week we talked about Ephesus and how the worship of gods and goddesses really didn't just permeate the culture. It was the central part of the culture. In the Roman Empire, people took their worship really seriously. And so you can imagine Paul, who begins to preach to the Gentiles, Paul had to be very careful he had to be careful to speak truths and not turn people off to the God of the Bible. And that was really challenging because people honestly, quite frankly, were quite comfortable in the gods and goddesses that they worshipped. It's kind of like where we're at now. If somebody came and tried to proselytize and preach to us about why we should worship many gods instead of just one God, it kind of put us off, wouldn't it? And so I think it's absolutely miraculous that Paul and his companions were able to share the gospel of Jesus Christ so successfully. It makes sense that people persecuted the Christians because it was offensive. It was very offensive to people who already had their gods and goddesses that they worshipped. For them to come around and to tell them that that's not really the true religion, that those aren't really real gods, it was highly offensive. The Roman government really backed kind of a state religion throughout the Roman Empire, and so they risked a lot. And today we're going to talk about that risk, the risk of following Jesus. As we advance forward a few years from where we were last week, I want to talk about what was going on in the Roman Empire because this wasn't that far removed from when Jesus went around and was preaching. So roughly what year would have it been, give or take a few years, whenever Jesus was preaching? When did he begin his ministry? How old was he? Yeah, about 30. So roughly 30, 20, 28, maybe a little bit before that AD. Jesus begins his ministry, and so when Paul and the disciples are going around, they begin planting churches really immediately after Jesus ascended. And right out of the gate, when Jesus ascended, what did the church face? Starting in Jerusalem. What's that? Yeah, persecution, severe persecution. Paul was leading the charge. Paul was very vocal. He hated Christians. He hated everything that they stood for. And Paul was madly in love with God. And I mean, this is a lesson that I've talked about before, so I don't want to get off on much of a soapbox here. But Paul's love for God never changed. And this is what sets Paul apart from abusers, because a lot of people will point to Paul when I go around and I talk about abuse in the church and why we should keep abusers away from the church, period. They'll point to Paul and they'll say, well, what about Paul? He even persecuted and had Christians killed. He persecuted Christians, had them killed, and he became an apostle and like the number one evangelist who spread Christianity. Well, the radical difference is that Paul talks about why he received mercy. Paul says, for I received mercy because I acted in ignorance and unbelief. Paul was acting in ignorance. Paul was not pretending to be someone he was not in order to worm his way in, to blend in like a chameleon, and then steal away from the innocence and the souls of innocent people. There's a radical difference. What Paul did before Paul was a Christian is Paul thought that he was doing everything to please God. He thought that the Christians were blasphemous and that the only way to bring honor and glory to God was to persecute those who profaned the name of God. Paul truly believed that. Paul didn't pretend. Paul didn't use deception. Paul didn't lie. He didn't sneak around. He didn't hide in the secrecy of the night. Paul was very open with what and who he stood for. And so I remind people, Paul's Paul's behaviors changed when Paul became a Christian. Paul's position towards God did not change. When Paul became a Christian, Paul still did everything for the honor and glory of God. The only thing that changed was his behaviors and what constituted honor and glory to God. So I just want to put that out there. Okay, so in the next couple decades after Jesus ascended, let's move into the 50s AD. And 20 years doesn't sound like a lot of time, does it? For some of us older people, right? 20 years doesn't seem like a long time. 20 years is kind of like a flash, right? Yeah, looking back, absolutely. Yeah, 20 years, you blink and it's gone. What's interesting, though, is a lot can happen in 20 years. And I'm going to talk about that during the sermon today, and some of the things that have happened here with the church in the last 20 years. But things that happened with the church in the first century in 20 years was really significant. Because by now, Paul turned from persecutor to evangelist. Paul was running on missionary journeys, beginning in like the early 40s. Paul hit the trail, and he was preaching Christ everywhere he went. Paul was under severe persecution everywhere he went. And the more Christianity spread, and it spread quickly. All right, we're seeing kind of, in our 20-year snapshot, we're seeing the exact opposite. Christianity is in free fall right now. The churches of Christ are losing people. We went from free fall in the last really 15, 20 years. The 20 years back, we were in kind of we started this downward trend. 15 years ago, if you picture an airplane going down, the nose pointed down pretty dramatically. And so the churches of Christ were in a free fall. Right now, we're in a tailspin, nosedive, thrusters full throttle. We are driving towards the ground quickly. In the next 20 years, not to panic my wife who's sitting here, because we have children, we're raising children. In 20 years, the churches of Christ may not exist. That's how quickly people are leaving. It's unprecedented. We have never seen this big of a decline in the church in the history of the churches of Christ. With that said, here's the hopeful part, and here's what the class is about, is that the exact opposite trend was happening in the first century, and all the odds were stacked against them. Persecution was high. State religion was their idol. The Roman Empire really promoted all of these gods and goddesses, and the Roman goddess, which in Ephesians was Artemis. It was everywhere. This was their life. Christianity broke through that, and in 20 years, flipped that around, where Christianity was now the primary religion throughout the Roman Empire. That's unbelievable. That's miraculous. So we were starting to see this shift, but there was this kind of rocky period in the 50s through probably really the height of it was in the 90s AD. So that first century, there was a lot of rocky turmoil. So what's interesting is Jesus really predicted that this was going to take place. So if you have your Bibles, turn to John chapter 21. And I'm going to back up just a little bit. John chapter 21. This is before Jesus ascended and after Jesus was crucified. So Jesus, rises from the dead. He's going around. He's appearing to people. And then the disciples come back. Jesus appears to them before he ascends. Where do I want to start? How about verse 4? Chapter 21. John 21, starting in verse 4. Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, do you not have any fish?" They answered him, "No." Now they're out on their boats. They're trying to fish. They're trying to catch fish. Keep in mind, Jesus died, and the disciples are doing what? This is important. Yeah, they went back to their old occupation. That's something we don't think about often, right? They weren't out evangelizing, and Jesus didn't give the Great Commission, and actually he hadn't given the Great Commission yet. But Jesus didn't die, and then the disciples just hit the trail and they're out preaching Jesus everywhere. They went back to their occupation, probably wondering what in the heck just happened. And what's interesting is they're not catching any fish. What's that reminiscent of? How were they called? When Jesus called his disciples, what were they doing? They were fishing, and they were catching what? Nothing. Yeah. Yeah, Jesus tells them, let your net down on the other side of the boat. Peter says, hey, we already washed the nets. We've been out all night. We've caught nothing, but because you said so, we'll do it. Yeah, nice. Yeah. So they let the net down when Jesus called them, and they caught so many fish that the nets were breaking, and they had to call in a second boat. That boat the boats begin sinking. There's all this weight. And Jesus says, from now on, you'll be catching men. Jesus dies, and what do? Are they catching men? They're going back to catch fish. And so this story is really significant because it parallels when Jesus called his disciples. And what's Jesus doing in this instance? After Jesus was crucified and raised from the dead, what's he doing? He's calling them to be fishers of men again. So he tells them, let your net down, cast the net on the right side of the boat, verse 6, and you'll find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. Again, it parallels the account when Jesus first called his disciples. The disciple whom Jesus loved therefore said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. And I've talked about the significance of this before, because Jewish people didn't do what? They didn't swim. They didn't go in the water. Why? It's where the demons were. Their belief was Leviathan, chaos, demonic forces, demons themselves were in the water. Incidentally, when Jesus cast out the legion of demons from the man who was on the corner of the Sea of Galilee, that they couldn't restrain him, where did Jesus send? Into the pigs, which went where? Over the cliff and into the water. Incidentally, where were the demons begging Jesus to go? Into the water. Why? Why is that significant? Because for Jewish people, that's where the demons live. So for Peter, both to get out of the boat when he walked on the stormy sea and to jump in the water now was huge. Peter in his mind didn't care. Peter jumped in. Peter was all in. He wanted to swim. He wanted to be the first one to meet Jesus on the shore. The rest of them followed behind. We're going to fast forward a little bit to verse 15. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Now, this is significant because we don't get this in the English language. And words are very important. Jesus said, in the original language, he said, Simon Peter, Simon son of John, do you agapao? Agapao is where we get the word agape. Agape is the noun form. Agapao is the verb form for love, which is this deep, passionate love. Agape love is this deep, passionate love where it's the sense of two hearts beating as one. You're unified. You're in unison with somebody. It's a deep connection. It's a love because you really know somebody well. It's a love where you finish, as they say in Frozen, you finish each other's sandwiches. You finish each other's sentences, right? It's this love. It's this very deep connection. Jesus says, do you agapao me? Do you love me more than these? He, that is Peter, said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. Where we get the word Philadelphia. Our city, Philadelphia, is the city of what? Brotherly love. Phileo is this, it's kind of a chummy, like, I love my friends. I love Natalie, and I love my friends, but I don't love them the same. There's Roxanne. You know what I mean, right? It's like we don't really distinguish in the English language. We don't distinguish different kinds of loves. Context determines the type of love. But in Greek, they had all kinds of different words for love. And so Peter comes back and he says, "Yes, of course I love you, buddy." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." Then he said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you agapao? Do you deeply, passionately love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I phileo." You know that I love you, buddy. I love you like a brother. He said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you," this is interesting and significant, "do you phileo me? Do you love me like a brother?" And that's right. That's how Peter's been responding. I love you like a brother. I love you like a brother. Jesus shifts his language. Do you love me like a brother? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you phileo me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I phileo. I love you like a you know that I love you like a brother."
Sounds like the 3 times denied.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it does really parallel the 3 times that Peter denied him. Because Peter, and this is really significant, I think. Theologically, I think this is significant. Because Peter's not, at least in my mind, and I know there's been a lot of ink poured over the meaning of these verses, but in my mind, Peter had already denied Christ, right? Jesus raises from the dead, and he's now asking him, do you love me all the way? How do you answer yes to that? When a few days before this, Peter, or a couple weeks before this, Peter had denied him. Right? I don't think it's that Peter doesn't love Jesus passionately, that Peter doesn't want his heart to beat the same as Jesus is. It's not that he doesn't want to, it's that he didn't. When push came to shove, when it came to following Christ all the way, Peter failed to test miserably, didn't he? And so I think that's a really good point. And I think this really parallels the point where Peter denied him 3 times. And Peter's not willing to say, not because he doesn't agapao Jesus, but because Peter didn't love Jesus that way. So Peter says, you know that I love you like a brother. And he's grieved that Jesus is asking him. I don't think because he's annoyed that Jesus is asking, or he's like, what are you getting at, Jesus? I think he knew exactly what Jesus was getting at. Peter, are you willing to follow me to the point of death? He was grieved because he knew what the implication of this was. He knew what the implication of loving Jesus, right? We throw those terms around all the time. I love God. I love Jesus. Right? We just kind of loosely throw them out there. Do we really? Do we really love him this deeply that we would follow him to death? Under persecution. Not like, yeah, I died in my sleep peacefully, at the age of 175. I lived a good life. I lived for Jesus. I followed him even to the grave. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about under severe persecution. Somebody comes in the middle of the night, and this was their reality in the first century. Somebody comes in the middle of the night, and all of a sudden your world changes fast. And you're forced to deny Christ or die. Will you choose to follow Christ? And to die for that, to die for your belief in Jesus Christ. So Peter knows, he knows what the implications are. And then Jesus says this, and I'm going to skip to this verse on the screen, John 21:18 and 19. Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. And then in case there's any misunderstanding what Jesus was saying, John gives us the interpretation of this. John was there, right? John was here. The disciple whom Jesus loved, John was here. He heard this conversation. So John gives his interpretation. He says, this he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And this is powerful. Listen to this. And after saying this, he said to him, follow me. You know the weight that Jesus was putting on Jesus in this moment? Peter, do you love me? Will your heart beat the same as mine? Do you love me that passionately that you would step into the fire with me and we would go down in flames together? Do you love me that deeply? You know that I love you like a brother, Lord. And if we're to fill in the gaps, Jesus says, no, that's not what I'm asking. Feed my sheep. Right? Take care of my little ones. The question I'm asking is, do you really love me? Do you love me all the way? Are we one and the same? Will you follow me no matter what? Lord, you know that I love you like a brother. Jesus comes back the third time. Do you love me like a brother? And at this point, Peter breaks. He's absolutely grieved. He still can't, the word will not come off of his lips. You know that I love you like a brother. Peter still won't say it. And then Jesus tells him this right after that. Here's the way that you're going to die, Peter. You're going to become an old man, which implies what? Either one of two things. Peter's going to do what with his life in the years in between? Till he's an old man, what's he going to do? Two choices. What's one choice? He's going to live for who? He's going to live for Jesus, or he's going to live for who else? Himself. Do you realize the weight of what Jesus is telling him here? So what's fascinating about this is we have this. This is Peter's bascilla. This is at the Vatican in Rome, Italy. This is Peter's church. It's one of the most famous buildings on the planet Earth. They built this traditionally on the site where Peter died. Now, Peter died, according to early church tradition, not many years later. By the early 2nd century, church tradition already was very strong that Peter died in Rome, and he died in 64 AD. Now, why is that year significant? 64 AD was the Great Fire of Rome under Emperor Nero. Also the year that Paul, the Apostle Paul, allegedly died. When Paul said, "I appeal to Caesar." And they looked at Paul and they were like, "Well, to Caesar you appealed, to Caesar you will go." Paul spends 2 years in prison in Caesarea, named after who? Caesar Augustus. Named after Caesar, Caesarea. Paul spends 2 years in prison there, and then he's transferred over to Rome. Paul spends 2 years in prison in Rome. He's under house arrest. And then all of a sudden, Paul just drops out of the scriptures. Never hear another word. Paul traditionally died in AD 64, the same year as Peter, maybe even the same time as Peter. In 64, the emperor was Nero. Nero took reign in let me see if I get this right, 58 AD, at the ripe old age of 16. Now, what could go wrong with a 16-year-old leading the entire Roman Empire? What could go wrong? Everything did go wrong. Nero was incredibly narcissistic. He was deeply into debauchery. He loved his, for those of you online, if you have kids, plug their ears or turn the volume down for a second. He loved his sex. Male, female, cousin, aunt, uncle, didn't matter. For Nero, it didn't matter. He loved orgies. He loved performing at theaters. The theater games were always very debaucherous. Usually included some kind of sadistic murdering of people. When you think of the Roman games where people were killed and mauled to death, that's under the reign of Nero. Nero loved this stuff. He loved gore. He loved guts. He loved intercourse. He loved all that stuff. He was a weird, twisted dude. He had his own mother killed. And he had to fund this stuff. It was very expensive. So when you're a ruler of an entire government, how do you fund things? Yeah, taxes. What were the Romans known for? What were the Romans hated for? Their high taxes. Under Nero's reign, they went through the roof. He's a 16-year-old kid who's got to fuel his sex addiction and his drinking addiction and every other addiction he had. So how do you fund it? Well, you're the emperor. Who cares? You tax people. So he was the most hated emperor, I think, in the history of mankind. That may be wrong. It's just my assessment. But when Paul appealed to Caesar, Paul knew who he was getting. He knew he was going to go before Nero. Which means what? Paul knew what, essentially? Yeah, he knew he was going to die. I don't think Paul was under any illusion that he was going to get out of it. In fact, on Paul's third missionary journey, Paul says, I don't know what's going to happen when I get to Jerusalem. All that I know is that everywhere I go, the Spirit tells me that trouble awaits me in Jerusalem. Paul's on that missionary journey. Paul makes a stop at this place called Miletus. He calls for the Ephesian elders to hurry up, and they have this hurried, deeply passionate meeting. And what's Paul's hurry? Paul wanted to make it to where? Jerusalem. Wait a second. I thought, Paul, you just said that you know that trouble awaits you. Everywhere you go, the Spirit tells you that trouble awaits you in Jerusalem. Yeah, Paul knew that. Paul was still in a hurry to get to Jerusalem. Why? Because the Passover was taking place. Well, what happens at Passover? Where do Jewish people go? They go to Jerusalem. They're required. Wherever they live throughout the Roman Empire, they're required at Passover to come into the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was packed with people during the Passover. Well, why would Paul care to get there? What do we know about Paul? Why would Paul care that Jerusalem was packed with people? Yeah, an audience. Paul's going to preach. Paul's going to preach. He's going to go out with a bang. So what's fascinating about this is, I've got to end here. I'm going to have to kind of clean this up at the beginning of next week. But Peter's bascilla, Peter's church here that's built, supposedly on the site where Peter died. Both Peter and Paul died under Nero's reign in AD 64 when this great fire destroyed multiple districts in Rome. Nero, it's alleged by historians that Nero set the fire himself. And that people are kind of catching on, and so as a scapegoat, he pinned it on the Christians who are already what? Hated by the people. People hated the Christians. So Nero pinned it on the Christians. Persecution went hog wild. The things that Nero did made his own people very uncomfortable. It was Hitler kind of stuff. Torture. Using Christians as street lamps. He would set them on fire, douse them with oil, put them on poles, and set them on fire alive. Nero was very dark, very twisted, very cruel, very demented. And so Peter, tradition has it that Peter was walking into Rome, that he had this vision and he saw Jesus, this same scene that we just read in John chapter 21. He saw Jesus say, "Peter, come to me." And Peter, according to this church tradition, very early in the 2nd century AD, Peter held his arms out as Jesus held his arms out to form the shape of the cross. Peter walked towards Jesus, and then Peter was arrested. Peter was crucified upside down. Now, what's fascinating is that Peter's bascilla, in the 1940s, Pope Pius XII, he ordered people to excavate underneath the church because he was like, I want to see what's underneath this thing. They excavated, guess what they find? A white tombstone from the 1st century. And not far from that, they found inside of a wall bones that belonged to a 60-year-old man. Now, of course, conclusions right away were, well, that's got to be Peter. The Pope said, not so fast. There's no way to definitively prove that's Peter. However, they found this grave site underneath this church in the 1940s.
We started this class off. I'm really concerned about the decline in the church.
Yeah.
The church will always be there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Because one, Jesus says in Matthew 20:28, I will be with you always, even to the end of the age.
Yeah.
So I'm troubled with the decline of membership.
Yeah.
But I am encouraged by the fact, example, wedding today, fine young Christian couple.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, and I'll talk about this during the sermon, but I think we're going to see another great awakening. I think we'll see it in our lifetime. And I think it's going to be a very positive thing. It's not a prophecy, it's just a prediction. I'm no prophet. But I think we're going to see some really encouraging things. Yeah, the church will always be.
Yes,
Jesus Christ isn't going anywhere. So